Hey everybody, Nikki the Death Doula here. I want to apologize, I don't have a new episode this week, but I did want to take a second just to say hello, and I will post a rewind here of an older episode, one of my personal favorites on disenfranchised grief. I've had a very, very hectic and not awesome couple of weeks, so I just have not had time to put together an episode, and I ran out of my pre-recorded episodes in the can, so to speak, so I don't have anything new to post this week. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope everybody's well, and I will be back for sure 100% with a new episode next week. So without further ado, here's an episode from way back in my early days of my podcast. This is episode number 4 on disenfranchised grief. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Good Grief, a podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief and loss with compassion and humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. So today we are going to talk about a subject near and dear to everybody's heart, myself included. So today we're talking about disenfranchised grief. What? I know. There are a shocking number of people who have never heard this term. And in fact, I had not even understood this term until about 3 years ago. It was 2019 when I went back to therapy. And I was told about the term disenfranchised grief. And I said, what the heck is that? Like most people would. So disenfranchised grief is when your grieving doesn't fit in with your larger society's attitudes about dealing with loss. Typically, disenfranchised grief might not be around death loss. It can be, by all means, but we'll dive into some examples of what disenfranchised grief is. So some examples of disenfranchised grief: typically unrecognized relationships. Earlier example from years ago would be like LGBTQ plus persons who may have lost their partner through death or through the end of a relationship, and they might not have felt safe, especially if they're not out to everybody just yet. They may not feel safe grieving the loss of a partner or a relationship. Same with polyamorous persons who might lose a non-primary partner through death or through end of a relationship. You could also argue non-traditional relationships. I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this, but you got a side piece and maybe nobody knows about it, and that relationship is very powerful to you and it ends suddenly. That can be an example. And that's the thing with things like that, are that morally speaking is, most people, if they were to hear, you lost a relationship with, or lost through death, somebody that you were seeing that you wasn't your primary relationship. Maybe you were married to somebody else and you didn't know about it. Morally speaking, no, maybe that wasn't okay, but that doesn't discount the relationship that you had. That relationship might have been very powerful. You may have had very strong feelings for each other. And morally speaking, may not have been okay, but that doesn't discount the grief. The grief is still there, and it still hurts. It's still powerful, and it's still emotional to you, to the person who lost somebody. You can't just say, just because maybe it's not ethical, that doesn't mean the grief shouldn't exist. It's there. You're allowed to grieve. You're allowed to hurt when something is removed from your life, or if you had like a large social circle that suddenly abandoned you, or turned your back on you. So we'll move on from that then. We could talk about losses that are considered, quote, less significant. I had a coworker who was in the process of adopting a child with a same-sex partner. They had been together for decades and decided they were ready to adopt a child, and they had a child ready, to be adopted. They'd met this child multiple times. Everybody was so happy. The child really loved the two of them. They really loved this child. And at the last minute, the adoption didn't go through. The birth parents decided that they didn't want to give them this child. And that to them was so traumatic. And there's a lot of stigma around adoption with same-sex couples, right? We can say that. We don't have to say whether we believe in it or don't, but we can all agree that there's a stigma around it, which in my opinion is unfortunate. But that's a loss. They didn't actually have that child. That child was not theirs. The adoption hadn't been finalized. But in their minds, they were already a family. And that child was, taken away in a manner of speaking. And that is a significant loss. That is highly traumatic. You could throw in examples of things like the loss of your home due to a fire. I think a lot of people could agree that that's a pretty significant grief. Grease? Okay. That's a pretty significant grief. But even things like loss of possessions. Let's say you had your purse stolen one day, and inside that purse was a favorite necklace that your best friend gave you when you were 5 years old. Maybe it was just a trinket from Walmart, but that necklace meant a lot to you. And some people might look at that and say, it's just a stupid necklace from Walmart. Why are you so upset? But it's still a loss. Society can also minimize grief associated with losses due to death or anything around, say, a teacher, a student, a therapy client, a pet. Pets are a big one. That I feel like I could talk about pet loss all day long because I've had pets. I've lost pets. And very interestingly, let's go on a little story about that. So I had adopted a special needs cat many years ago, and I loved this little guy, and he loved me. He was a handful. He was special needs. And at the time I had my elder cat, Yuna, who had pretty much only ever been an only cat, so to speak, and she didn't like it when I brought other pets in the house. So we had a setup where the one cat was upstairs, the other cat was downstairs, and that's just how it was. And the special needs cat, he had cerebellar hypoplasia, so it's like cerebral palsy in humans. And yes, I named him Derp because I'm mean. But he couldn't get up and down he could get up and down the stairs, but we were always worried about him falling, so we just kept a baby gate at the top of the stairs, and he stayed up here, Una stayed downstairs, and that was that. For a myriad of reasons, it just wasn't working out to have him here. So we had to find another home for Derp, and it worked out amazingly well. The couple who adopted one of Derp's siblings from his litter, they lived in Washington, D.C. They have one of his brothers, and I had actually become friends with her through Facebook because we learned through the shelter where we adopted these pets, like, oh, you should connect with this person. They have their sibling. And we became Facebook friends, and we bonded over the fact that these two cats had such similar mannerisms and personality traits. It was adorable. But they were willing to take him. So it could not have worked out better. And he is so happy right now, you guys. He has his brother. They snuggle all the time. It's worked out very well. And bonus, my husband and I got 2 new friends out of this because Derp's parents, Rachel and Sam, are just fantastic. And we go visit them once a year. Funny story, Derp recognizes me every time I come. It's great. But when we had to rehome him, that was a loss for me. I really, really missed him. And it was so painful for me to take him out of the house and move him several states away. And you could almost hear people thinking, God, it's just a cat and he's not dead. It doesn't matter. That was hard for me. And I won't even get into losing my other cat. She was 19 when we had to have her put down. I'll start crying. I can't talk about her. She was my best friend and in a weird way, my soulmate. So I could do a whole episode on her, and I won't do that right now. But I talked earlier about stigma, loss surrounded by stigma with the whole exterior relationship, as you could say. But there are other losses like infertility. Finding out you're infertile in, having a child might have been your one thing you wanted in life, and finding out you can't do that, there's a huge loss with that. That's death by suicide or overdose. There's a lot of stigma surrounding that. And we're in the midst of this opioid crisis. And people are dying every day from overdose. And it's easy to sit back and say, well, they shouldn't have done drugs. But we could also do an entire episode on addiction, which I will not, because it's not, maybe I will one day. I don't know. But suicide and overdose, obviously there's a lot of stigma around that. Why couldn't you stop that person from killing themselves? That was awful that they killed themselves. I will do an episode on suicide. That'll be a huge trigger warning. So I'll make sure to mark the crap out of that episode. But there's a lot of stigma around suicide loss that is unfounded and hurtful. I'm going to get angry, so we'll move on. Loss through abortion or miscarriage, stillborn children, anything involving children, I just feel like has to be the worst pain in the world. But there's stigma around that, right? There's stigma around abortion. Again, we're not going to get into the politics of it. I don't like to discuss politics. Whether you believe in it or not, that's still a loss. So, and miscarriages. I had a dear friend who was trying to have a child for the longest time, and she suffered multiple miscarriages. Some of them were late term. And that is so painful. I've never been through that, so I can't say. But the amount of pain she was in. She does have 2 beautiful children now. And I'm just so insanely happy for her. But the thing with that is, let's say somebody suffers a couple miscarriages, and then down the line they successfully have a child that, is doing wonderfully. That doesn't take away the miscarriage they had. That loss is still there. That was still a child that they lost. Okay, moving on. So estrangement with loved ones who have addiction, or loss of cognitive function through Alzheimer's, mental illness, dementia, aging. That's a grief too. So we talked about types of loss, like things you can lose that might be considered non-traditional, that would be considered disenfranchised grief. But the act of grieving itself and the act of mourning itself that doesn't align with societal norms, we could throw that in there. People will expect you to cry a lot, withdrawal, maybe lose your appetite, sleep a lot, never sleep, have, all these feelings, and you may not feel those. Those particular feelings might not hit you right away. And I remember at my brother's funeral telling jokes to some people and laughing. Yeah, of course I cried at my brother's funeral, but I didn't have to sit there and sob the entire time. And sometimes people look at your actions and your reactions and a loss, and there might be judging along with that. Or, let's say you suffer a traumatic loss and you start using unsafe coping mechanisms like drinking alcohol, or, using drugs, self-harm. So those are there. I listed a ton of examples of disenfranchised grief, and you might experience a disenfranchised grief in your life. I guarantee you have, whether it was traumatic and life-changing or whether it was small, you've probably experienced a loss that others might view as not a loss. You may have experienced one of those losses. The important thing is you do need to face your griefs. You do need to address your grief. So whether you've suffered one of those losses, knowing that it's okay to feel grief, and it's okay to grieve the loss of a pet, a non-traditional relationship, a job, a home, your favorite pair of shoes, and you have had the same pair of shoes and you love those shoes to death and they were stolen out of the back of your car. It's okay to grieve that. If that's something that's significant to you, then it's significant to you. I feel like we could do a full episode alone on COVID-19, but let's dive into that for just a second here. A lot of people went through, the entire world went through this. We all went through this, whether you believed in it or didn't, whether it affected you or did not. It did affect you. Whether you personally lost someone to this disease or during this pandemic, we all suffered losses with this. We were all locked in our homes for a period of time. We were all, mandated to change our lifestyle for a while. To this day, I still wear my mask when I go to the store, but I'm hyper paranoid and I have elder parents. So I am trying to be respectful to them. But that aside, we all suffered losses through that. And that might not be something you would think, okay, well, there was a pandemic. We all went through this together, and it absolutely was a loss. You know, it was a grief. Life has changed, and forever. Anything after this, there is no back to normal, you know, and that's a grief too, knowing that life is forever changed. Nothing's going to go back to the way it was prior to COVID. It will in some senses, but we're forever changed because of this, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that's still a grief, knowing that we can't go back to quote unquote the before times. All right, kids. Well, I have listed a lot, and that was a little heavy, and I apologize. But disenfranchised grief is a super important topic, which is why I wanted to get this out early in my show to talk about, because as I said, these aren't griefs that are recognized and may not be recognized by people close to you. You might feel these losses and feel that you're completely alone and isolated because you're grieving them alone, because you feel you can't share them for whatever reason. So if you are experiencing that type of a loss and you don't know what to do, reach out. You might be surprised. You might have a friend who has been through something very similar and you didn't know that about them and they didn't know that about you. And hey, you've got this great thing to bond over now and you have somebody you can talk to. If you're not comfortable reaching out to a friend, talk to a therapist, or you can reach out to a grief coach. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Seriously, if you need help, you know, reach out for it. It's okay. Your feelings are valid. Regardless of what you've lost, regardless of what you are feeling, your feelings are valid because they're yours. We got a little heavy, but real quick, a nice little nugget of knowledge I read. There was a study recently that doctors have found a specific food that can cause years of feelings of grief and loss. It's called wedding cake. I know. I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry at all. I stand by my terrible humor. So thank you so much for tuning in to this episode on disenfranchised grief. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, you know, please feel free to check out other episodes, subscribe, leave reviews, do whatever it is you're supposed to do with podcasts. And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. Good Grief was brought to you by me. You can find me online at nikkithedeathdoula.com. Today's episode was produced by me. Research and scripts written by me. Your host is me. Editing and sound design also me. Music is not me. Music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod. License information can be found at filmmusic.io/standard-license. Special thank you to my best friend and husband for constantly reassuring me that I don't suck.